What is the lead leg block? How can it help you throw harder? And how do you train it? In this video, we're gonna go over a sample routine, start to finish, showing how we would approach training the lead leg block for one of our athletes. But first, I'm Ben Brewster, co-founder of Tread Athletics. We train thousands of high school, college, and professional pitchers, both remotely and in person. Let's dive in. So the main purpose of the lead leg block from a velocity generating and physics standpoint is we're trying to transfer all that momentum and energy from our stride phase, from the linear move. We're trying to be able to transfer that into rotation to be able to send that energy up the chain. If we can take that stride, turn it into rotation, send energy up into the torso, now we have a good chance to send that energy out and around into the arm and ultimately get that into the ball. So the lead leg actually basically creates a stable anchor for the pelvis to rotate into. And so you can imagine this analogy of, let's say you're pitching on a muddy mound. And so when you plant, that foot's slipping all over the place, that foot's unstable. And so your pelvis doesn't have something stable to actually rotate and accelerate and then decelerate into. And so if that foot's unstable, it's kind of like the saying, you can't shoot a cannon out of a canoe. That instability ends up being a leak and less energy and momentum is actually sent up the chain. What we want ideally from that lead leg is we want to be able to plant and we want this leg to stabilize. If this lead leg can stabilize, now we have a chance to actually aggressively rotate and unload the pelvis into that lead leg without energy being leaked into the ground. The energy can be leaked in one of three ways. The energy can be leaked forward as that knee continues to sink forward. We've all probably seen guys like that. You land and that lead leg continues to sink. That represents an energy leak in that anterior to posterior or that back to front direction. You can also have a leak in the vertical direction. So you land and you continue to sink into that lead leg. Maybe not necessarily forward, but you continue sinking down into it. So that would be a vertical leak. The other plane that lead leg needs to be able to stabilize in is medial to lateral. So that rotational plane. So you land and then that lead knee just kind of continues bowing out. You might see the ankle start to bow out. You might see the knee start to bow out. You might see everything start to collapse. This can be especially common for guys that are a little cross-body. That knee starts to bow out. And so those are all different types of leaks that can happen in that lead leg. And so again, if we have any of those leaks happening, we're just dissipating potential energy that could be sent up the chain. We're dissipating that into the ground. That's going to result in less usable ball velocity and a less efficient lower half. But the key point here is that that lead leg does need to stabilize, but it doesn't always need to be this picture perfect lead leg. Think of like a Walker Buehler example. He doesn't have that like perfect paw back mechanism.
Hey guys, Tread Editor here. Let's quickly explain what a paw back mechanism is. The term comes from proper running technique where your foot paws backwards, very similar to how an animal runs. Let's look at Usain Bolt. When his leg extends, you'll see it come down and paw backwards, striking the ground more efficiently. In the pitching world, the paw back mechanism refers to the lead knee extending backwards in the ball release. Okay, let's get back to Ben.
But that lead leg hits, that knee stabilizes, that knee's not wobbling over the place, the foot's not wobbling, and so it still does the job well enough to give that pelvis something stable to rotate into. In a perfect world, what you would like to see is that you would like to see, as that foot plants and the hips rotate, this glove side of the pelvis, as it rotates, it's pulling on this upper leg bone. So it's pulling on that femur. As it rotates, it actually pulls that knee into extension. As we get into some of the movements and drills and exercises, you'll see the theme is rotation. The theme is that how this lead leg extends and stabilizes is this leg is a byproduct of what the pelvis is doing. So we can rotate our pelvis effectively. You're gonna start to see that lead leg block more effectively. If we don't rotate, if we just kind of crash into our lead leg, it's not going to have the ability to stabilize quite as well. So that knee extending is a result of the hips rotating. It's not a result of this quad firing. It also shouldn't be a result of just vaulting up over the lead leg. You can do that as well, but again, that's not the most efficient way to actually send energy up the chain, which is from the pelvis rotating. Using the analogy of the feet are anchors, the pelvis is the driver. Just as a demonstration, if I rotate my pelvis back here, you see I've loaded the back leg, I've wound that spring. If I rotate my hips the other way, now I have something to unload. You'll see how that lead leg responds to that. And so again, the pelvis is the driver of that knee extension and of that lead leg block. If we can rotate better, we can block better. One final tip as we're about to get into the routine is that in my experience, that lead leg block should happen automatically. I used to have a lead leg that really collapsed. As I didn't know how to create tension, I would fly open, I'd be very linear, I'd extend, and I would just collapse the lead leg. As I learned to rotate, to hold tension, and to unload better, that lead leg started to clean up naturally. And so it wasn't something where I specifically focused on in my brain what the lead leg was doing while I was throwing. That lead leg is something that should take care of itself if we address it more from an indirect standpoint. Addressing it from the back hip, from loading tension, and from unloading from the hips, expecting that that lead leg should take care of itself. So while you're pitching in your next bullpen, your next catch play session, your thought process typically shouldn't be, on what the lead leg is doing, and that's where your focus is. It should really happen as a byproduct of making sure we're strong enough, we're stable enough, we have enough mobility, and we're learning how to rotate effectively. If we do that, the lead leg should take care of itself. As we go through this whole routine, keep that in mind. We're trying to set up an environment so that that lead leg responds properly at that point in the throw, so that your actual mental focus will be more on the beginning of the throw and on loading rotation. So the first part of this routine, we'll look through the mobility side of it. So not everybody here watching this video will have a mobility restriction, but I'm gonna mention it for the guys that do. What are we gonna talk about? We're gonna talk about the hamstring, being able to allow the hip to flex. So being able to get over the front side for high slot guys to be able to rotate through, that can really be a limiting factor. It's less a limiting factor for low slot guys where it doesn't require nearly as much hip flexion. So the exercise here, getting a split stance. So we're essentially mimicking that position out front. You can exaggerate it, get to the point where you do feel that hamstring stretch. From here, we're gonna do iso holds. We're gonna get in that position. You start to feel a stretch, and we're gonna think about squeezing the ground together. And squeezing the ground together, you'll feel a nice, strong contraction in the hamstring. 10-second hold, relax a little bit deeper. 10-second hold, relax a little bit deeper. The other thing you can do, once you've gone through that for a couple minutes, you can put your hands on the ground and you can essentially just work through extensions here. So you're contracting the quad, which is going to inhibit the hamstring and help you get a deeper stretch. So it's still more of an active stretch using the quad. And then when you're doing the isos, use an active contraction from the hamstring. We're not just passively hanging out, letting the hamstring stretch statically. So that's number one. Number two is hip rotation. So as we rotate into the lead hip, if we don't have adequate range of motion in that lead hip, you run out of room and the knee will start to bow out. So we need to open up a little bit of hip internal rotation, a little bit more rotation here in that lead hip for certain guys. So you're gonna get in the hip 90-90 position. That lead leg is gonna be in this position here, and we're gonna turn and rotate into that lead leg. You should feel comfortable but deep stretch in the upper hamstring adductor area. You're winding up those deep rotators in the hip. From there, we're gonna do iso holds again. We're gonna try to drive that foot down into the ground. We're slowly ramping up intensity for 10 seconds. Drive, 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 drive. After 10 seconds, we're gonna relax, do the opposite. So we're trying to lift that foot up off the ground as hard as we can, and we're trying to stay in that full position while lifting up. So essentially, we're taking ourselves into that end range hip rotation, and we're doing activations in both directions to try to open up and own that new range of motion. So that's the hip flexion and the IR. So now let's move on to the strength and conditioning side. Before we get into some of these more nuanced exercises, I just wanna make sure that you guys are doing some sort of bilateral or two leg and single leg or unilateral strength exercises in your lifting program. Again, this will help you deal with both the back to front forces and the vertical forces. So the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes, those need to be sufficiently strong to be able to absorb those forces. So squats, deadlifts, RDLs, and then single leg RDLs, lunges, single leg kettlebell swings, things like that are gonna help round out your lifting program and make sure that strength in those planes aren't the limiting factor. So this exercise will be the hip airplanes exercise. The idea is as we begin to rotate into that lead leg, we need that outer glute to be able to decelerate that pelvis so that pelvis can stick and send energy up the chain as opposed to just continuing to go. So if that outer glute is strong, it's able to contract eccentrically as we rotate. It's able to control the pelvis and be able to stick that send energy up the chain more effectively. So the outer glute needs to be strong. A way to start this would be up against a wall, back foot for balance only. We're firmly planted in that front side, hands on the hips. And as you rotate up, we're gonna slowly control ourselves down into that lead hip. You should feel that outer glute wind up and load up, and you should feel tension in that glute med, glute max area. Wind up, control down. The key here is controlling it slowly. It's not torquing from the low back. It's not just rushing through it to start. Make sure you're really controlling that position on the way down. You can make this more difficult by adding a band. You're not gonna need a ton of band tension. So something like a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch band to start. Step through the band, wrap it around your hips. And then from there, it's gonna be really trying to rip you down into that lead leg. You have to control that. Don't let it rip you down, control it slowly. So same position, start up, control down. Control down. And again, you can make it more challenging by coming off the wall, which is really gonna challenge the stability aspect of the movement. You can also add a cable machine so you can actually quantify the load. Use a cable rope, wrap it around and control that movement, making sure the glute is able to control the pelvis decelerating into the lead leg. So the next movement is gonna be a rotational kettlebell swing. So we're basically overloading that deceleration path, teaching the outer glute and strengthening the outer glute to be able to decelerate that pelvic rotation. So similar to the hip airplanes, but now we're actually gonna be overloading it a little bit more. So we're gonna start in that split stance, and we're basically doing a diagonal pattern kettlebell swing from there. You should be loading up the outer glute here. Again, try not to use the low back to get that range of motion. and try not to use the arms to swing it on the way up. That load is happening from the outer glute and then recoiling, outer glute, recoil. You can try to match your arm slot in this movement. So a little bit more north-south here, a little bit more east-west here, because again, in your delivery, the more rotational guys are gonna be having to deal with a little bit more medial to lateral ground force. The north-south guys are gonna be having to deal with a little bit more vertical ground force. So we talked about some common mobility pieces, we talked about some common strength issues. Now let's talk about some of the stability and kind of balance proprioception piece of it. So we need the muscles in the bottom of the foot to be able to stabilize as well. We need all the muscles in the glute that stabilize the pelvis, stabilize the hip, to be able to contract and fire together. So there's kind of a balance piece of this as well. We can use a medicine ball up against a wall, get in a split stance. The more narrow or in line those feet, the more unstable you're gonna be, the more you're gonna have to balance. The wider you get here, the more stable you'll be, the easier the movement will be. So from the split stance, we're just doing wall taps. And you can go a little bit heavier on this one. This is 6, you can go 8, 12, 15 pounds to make it a little bit more challenging. But again, we're just adding that rotational piece, having to stabilize. I like doing this one barefoot or in socks on that front foot, so the muscles on the bottom of the foot have to really contract, stabilize, and learn to help with the balance piece of it. I would progress this one once you get comfortable with that. Take the back foot off the ground, and now we're doing med ball wall taps on one leg. So it's really gonna challenge the balance piece of it. Again, we're not trying to blow up the wall. We're just trying to make sure the glute and the muscles on the bottom of the foot can help to stabilize, working on the balance piece of that front leg. So talked about the mobility piece, the strength piece, the balance and proprioception, stability piece. This is more of a feels piece. And so you can use either a 3D strap like we have. You probably don't have one of these, so you might need to use a couple bands looped together, attached to a cable column, attached to a fence, a wall, whatever you have to attach it to. So loop it like this. We're gonna take one full 360-degree turn towards our glove side. I have a good amount of weight on this. You want enough that it feels like it's pulling you forward. It feels like it's pulling you off balance, and you have to keep your upper half back and actually stabilize to not be pulled forward on your front foot. You might have 40 pounds, you might have 60, 70 pounds, but not like 10 pounds, not like 200 pounds. So we're gonna get in this position. From here, hold your arms out. That's gonna basically match your rotation plane. So for me, I'm a little bit lower slot, but again, this plane is kind of what you want to be able to rotate in the movement. From here, we're gonna load that back side, unload into the front leg, and just feel that front leg stabilize as our pelvis rotates. So this isn't really a strength movement, it's more of just a feel. Higher slot guys, it's gonna be more this feel, just to feel how rotation drives the front leg into extension. That's the same feel you can then chase in lasso throws, in rocker throws, as you get into your throwing drills for the day. The other movement that you can actually incorporate into your lifts, as opposed to single arm cable rows, dumbbell rows, single arm lat pull downs, you can actually overload this one quite a bit. You can do 70, 80, 100 pounds on this. We're just gonna do an ipsilateral row, so it's a same-sided row. So we're actually driving this movement from rotation of the pelvis into a row. So as opposed to just having an arm-driven movement, we're letting rotation from that back hip initiate and then finishing with the arm. So again, you'll see full speed, the hips drive the movement. And again, just getting comfortable staying behind the lead leg, letting rotation drive it. That's when you can still overload in your regular lifts for the week. So as we get into more throwing specific feels, the common theme here is gonna be winding tension in the back hip so that you have something to unload so that then the lead leg can work as intended. One note here is if you don't even know what that means and you haven't been able to feel tension in the back hip, one tip for this is to just start in an athletic position, and you can think about doing a chop into that back hip. And so that position right there, you should feel that outer hip wound up and you should feel like there's tension. From here, you can think about stepping forward while holding that tension. And so you see this actually feels a lot like a swing feel. And so sometimes we'll actually use, we call it the daddy hack drill, but it's basically a swing feel. Guys oftentimes don't have an issue loading tension, unloading tension. When you give them a bat, you just tell them to swing as hard as they can. They can do it. They understand how to load into the ground, unload. The lead leg looks great, kind of forget how to do that. They aren't able to transfer that pattern to a downhill plane with a full stride out of their delivery. So we've actually tried blending that swing feel for certain guys. Give them a bat or just have them imagine having a bat in their hand, try to hit a home run, see if they can do it. A lot of times they'll be able to do it. So then it's about, okay, you already have that pattern in you. You already kind of know how to use the ground to rotate. Can we blend this back into an actual throwing type movement? We might blend it more of a top hand drill, something like a 1 pound Indian club, or again, it can just be imagining they're holding a bat, but something like a top hand drill where they're loading and unloading, loading and unloading. You can think about being a little bit more downhill plane, because again, the difference in a swing is a little bit more uphill versus downhill. So you can think about more so than swinging in a downhill plane. And what do you notice? This starts to look a lot like a traditional lasso drill. So now we can start blending that feel of loading into the back hip and unloading into more of a traditional lasso type throw. We can blend that with plyo balls, weighted balls, catch play. And so that starts to now blend into our backwards chaining, our plyo drill work for the day. So the next feel that you can work on pre-throwing would be any sort of diagonal med ball chop variation. I like doing it off some sort of short mound, short box, or some sort of slope so that you can more closely mimic that actual downhill plane and rotate into the lead leg. I think it's a little bit tough with certain flat ground variations or certain like shot put variations where the rotation ends up being a little bit more uphill. So I'm more of a fan of the diagonal chop variations from here to where we can mimic that same downhill action, that same diagonal path to get into that oblique sling and rotate down into that lead leg. I like starting without really any stride. Can we just do more of like a rocker variation downhill and just try to see, can that lead leg extend from rotating? So I like getting a little bit like a figure 8 path, rotate into the front leg, load the back hip, flick the ball, rotate, load the back hip, find the back hip, and then you're not using the arms to accelerate the ball, using the pelvis to accelerate, and you're just flicking the wrist. The issue I have when guys try to velo medicine ball throws at times is it just becomes using their arms to drive the throw as opposed to using the hips. So I prefer this to be more of like a low effort feel for the hips as opposed to a max effort feel from the arms. You'll also notice if you start trying to rip like 40-mile-an-hour med ball throws, this is a 2-pound medicine ball, a lot of guys will feel like a tug on that front shoulder when they try to overload that movement. So that's not the point. You can progress this to hover drills. You can progress this to full leg lifts. You can progress this to roll-ins, but essentially we're just taking the actual throw piece out of it with a ball, and we're able to work on that downhill diagonal chop. But I like starting with a rocker variation here. So now let's talk about some throwing specific drills and how we can help use that to drive a little bit better lead leg blocking action, because we're going back to the theme of using rotation to drive extension of that lead leg. It's gonna start with the basics. And so for me, the most basic foundational drill that you can do is take the arm action out of it, lasso drill, and just work on loading the back hip, unloading into the lead leg, make sure that extends. Most players can get this pretty quickly because we're taking everything else out of it. We're taking the leg lift out of it, we're taking the stride out of it, we're taking even the arm swing out of it, and we're literally just isolating to loading, unloading tension into the ground and funneling that energy like a tornado up the chain. Simple cue here, you can allow that heel to come up. We're just finding the back hip, letting the arm stay up in plane around 90 degrees. The arm is nice and relaxed. Find the back hip, unload, allow that energy to just send up the chain. You can think about like throwing the belly button into the lead leg, but again, rotation. If you still can't get this, some players will still struggle to get this. Again, might be a mobility issue, might be a stability issue, might be a strength issue, probably not. Probably has to do more with the patterning. So a couple of constraints that can help make sure they get this right. One is that you can put a medium length hurdle in front of the knee, just so that when they leak forward and do it wrong, that gives them that immediate feedback. Another thing you can do is add band tension around the hips, where it's anchored in the front and open. So it's really forcing you open and forward. Your body's gonna have to respond to that by holding closed a little bit longer, finding tension. And so feeding the flaw, being pulled open, ripped open from a band, can actually really help make sure you find tension and rotate a little bit better. And then the third constraint that can help certain guys is actually putting that front foot up on a short box or a slant board. And so this is gonna exaggerate the feel of that back to front force, where you can feel that lead leg almost push back into the pelvis and send that impulse up the chain. So lasso drills are a great first one. The second one would be built into some sort of rocker variation. So same thing, we're taking the stride out of it, we're taking the leg lift out of it, but now we're incorporating the full handbrake, the full arm action, seeing if we can still find the back leg, rotate, and send that energy up the chain. So I find for a lot of guys, the figure 8 version works really well because you can not really have to think about the arm action. You're still focused on just loading the back hip and just letting the swing from the arm take the arm into position, relax, deep retraction. But again, the focus is still finding the back hip and rotating. And again, you should see the lead leg clean up, you should see the arm on time, and that energy funnel up the chain. You can still use any of those constraints that we just talked about, you can progress to different variations of the rocker throws. From there, you're going to try to build into more specific drill variations where you are going to be incorporating a leg lift. So walking windups, step backs, things of that nature. You are going to be incorporating a stride phase. But a couple honorable mentions that I want to talk about, drills that require a little bit more counter rotation. Because for guys that struggle to rotate, if you start them a little bit more closed off with the pelvis, it's going to force them. They now have to rotate 180 degrees and get the hips from here all the way through here. So it exaggerates that rotational piece of the throw. So the three I'll highlight here, one would be the janitor throw. And so just loading, winding tension into the back hip. Again, you might be here, you might only have range to get here, but you're biasing tension and you're biasing counter rotation. It's gonna make it more obvious that you need to rotate to get through your front leg. So janitor throws are a big one. Next one would be a drop step. You could do a drop step or a quick pick, but drop step, you're gonna face completely away from the target, gain momentum, rotate and throw. The third would be turn and burns. So if you're doing any sort of pull downs or shuffles, turn and burns can be a good substitute for those because you're still getting momentum, but you're having to start more closed off and be able to fully rotate through, again, emphasizing the rotational piece while still getting linear momentum. So you're backpedaling a few steps, plant, fire, and that lead leg is gonna have to work really hard to not fall forward on your face and not vault up and over the lead leg. So those are the three that I would highlight specifically, but any of these other variations can work as long as the focus is on finding tension and rotating down into that lead leg as opposed to extending and vaulting over the lead leg. The theme is rotation, and hopefully that's come across in the video. I wouldn't focus specifically on thinking about your lead leg. Focus on the pieces, the ingredients that build up to allowing the lead leg to work properly, and trust me, that'll work a lot better. Thanks for watching this video. Hope you got something out of it. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Drop a comment if you haven't already or you have suggestions for future topics, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.